The arrival of the Beryllium Corporation of America to Hazleton in 1957 brought a welcome economic stimulus and a source of steady employment. But all that remains of the plant is a Cold War legacy of occupational disease. Want to hear the rest of the story? Come along with me. Also known as Berylco, Kawicki Berylco, Cabot Corporation, Beryllium Corporation of America, Ashmore. It's in Pennsylvania, just outside of Hazleton, PA. It was in operation from 1957 to about 1980. The facility description was that the Manhattan Engineering District and the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, contracted with the facility for the production of beryllium metal, beryllium oxide, and beryllium powder. The AEC contracted with the facility for the refining and fabrication of beryllium. Later, the facility produced beryllium blanks for the Y2 plant at Dow, Rocky Flats. First, let me tell you about a man. We're going to call him Johnny, just to protect the family name. He knew beryllium was a toxic metal, but in 1958 he jumped at the chance to become the first machinist for the new beryllium plant just outside of Hazleton. The plant made high-tech parts for weapons and spacecrafts with this metal that was stronger than steel but lighter than aluminum. You know, like most everybody in this coal mining town, it's at the edge of the Poconos. He was happy to be working. You got to understand, he said, the mines were down because of flooding and the lack of demand for anthracite coal. And if you got a job, you took it. Around the mid-90s, he started having trouble breathing and coughing so uncontrollably he couldn't do much else. A doctor diagnosed beryllium disease. It's a lung condition that has sickened an estimated 1,200 Americans, including many in Pennsylvania, who worked for the lightweight metal plant during the last how many decades? No one counted the number of deaths. Now, there were pressure from lawsuits and growing public concern, and the federal government proposed a plan to compensate victims up to $100,000 apiece. But the doctors studying the disease worried that many cases will come in years to come. Why did they worry about that? Because the symptoms often take decades to appear after beryllium exposure. They worried about those who still worked at plants that processed beryllium, including 2 plants in Reading, Pennsylvania, about an hour from here. Beryllium's not radioactive, but it can be toxic to those who breathe the dust or fumes. It scars their lungs. And a pulmonary specialist at the U of P studied the condition. Little is known about the disease except that it doesn't go away. Some people have mild breathing problems while some die within a few years. Steroids can slow the progression of the disease, but it doesn't offer a cure. Studies of those who still work with beryllium, as well as those who once worked in the now defunct plant, show about 15% exhibit an immune response to beryllium. Doctors estimate that about half of those will get sick in the future. But when the plant was first built in the 50s, plant workers were intrigued by the special properties of this high-tech wonder metal. This gate doesn't look that old. It looks like they put new gate up here. And just seeing this tells me that the ground is still toxic. They had a lot of this stuff leach into the ground, and what they did was just leave it, and they fenced it off. Some companies can be so uncaring. No, I am not going in there. I'm not even going to try. As far as I'm concerned, everything beyond that fence is considered poisonous. That's where the plant was. Here's another angle. And of course the breeze is picking up. Beautiful morning out. Looks like the barbed wire on top is fairly new. Or I should say newer. Not real new, but newer. Yeah, they want to keep people out of here, and I can't say I blame them. If you go in there, I think you're a little nuts. There's nothing to see, really. It's all been destroyed. The plant was destroyed. There may be a few foundations here and there, but not worth being poisoned. Let me tell you about another man. We'll call him Joey. He loved his work. His daughter said that she remembers him showing her a beryllium ball bearing that was lighter than a cotton ball, yet stronger than steel. He was passionate about metal, and he thought beryllium was the coolest thing. At first, he toiled in the furnaces and forges, processing the beryllium ore into metal, but he quickly worked his way into management and research. Workers were supposed to wear respirators in high-exposure jobs, and they had to take off their work clothes and shower before leaving the plant, and he was obsessive about those things. More than a decade after he left, though, the beryllium dust he breathed in at work began to take a toll on him. First, he simply seemed tired and lethargic, but then he began to have such trouble breathing he needed constant oxygen. He died on Christmas Eve, 1996, the day after his 66th birthday. Most of the estimated 26,000 workers who were exposed to beryllium worked for the National Weapons Laboratory at Rocky Flats, Colorado, Hanford, Washington, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. But more than 4,000 workers worked in Pennsylvania for private beryllium processing plants that contracted with the Defense Department. The beryllium company, which changed name over the years, closed around 1980, but in Reading, NGK Metals and Brush-Wellman Inc. still processed beryllium. In proposing to compensate beryllium workers, Energy Secretary acknowledged that the government had for decades fought lawsuits filed by victims of this disease regardless of merit. Now there's a sad statement right there. Well, they fought the lawsuits regardless of merit. That's just wrong. Now, since the Manhattan Project, the United States spent more than $4 trillion and employed more than 500,000 workers to develop and produce nuclear weapons. As nuclear weapons production workers confront thousands of layoffs, they are concerned that occupation-related health problems are now a low priority for the government. The preliminary results of health assessment of nuclear weapons production workers who worked for the DOE contractors was conducted by Elizabeth Arvel Samas for the Alice Hamilton College of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Worker International Union. It revealed workers concerned about future health problems, inadequate health insurance, and high levels of exposure to substances such as ionizing radiation, beryllium, asbestos, and carbon tetrachloride. These nuclear veterans of the Cold War have a statutory entitlement to medical surveillance and medical exams that have never been funded. Ironically, there's no ongoing remedial activity for those contaminated workers, yet DOE is spending $6.5 million per year for remediating contaminated dirt and nuclear waste. In the mid-1950s, the AEC, the DOE's predecessor, awarded the Beryllium Corporation a $23 million five-year contract to produce 500,000 tons of beryllium, a strong but malleable metal that was used in nuclear, electronics, and aerospace industries. The plant refined thousands of tons of beryllium ore into beryllium metal. More than 1,200 people worked in the facility from 1957 till it shut down in 1980. At the time the Hazleton plant was designed, scientists already knew about the dangers posed by exposure to beryllium dust. Workers confronting high exposure levels developed acute symptoms similar to bronchitis and pneumonia. Lower exposure levels can cause chronic beryllium disease, CBD, characterized by lung inflammation and scarring. including granuloma and the growth of tumor-like masses on capillaries in the lungs. CBD can take from several years to several decades to develop, and it becomes so disabling, with such symptoms as shortness of breath, coughing, chest pain, fatigue, and loss of appetite and weight. Most are able to control these symptoms with prescription drugs, but the disease can be fatal without early detection and treatment. The AEC sets air quality standards for beryllium dust in 1950, 7 years before this plant opened. In 1993, a Wilkes-Barre newspaper uncovered documents that revealed the 1958 AEC air sample taken at the beryllium plant found dust levels that were 330 times the maximum allowed by federal short-term exposure standards. 330 times. That's just way wrong, way too much. The Hazleton plant also took air samples at least twice a year from 1957 to 1962. These samples also exceeded the allowed exposure, even though the company had installed new air safety equipment in 1958. So the levels were still too high, even though they installed equipment to filter the air. After the Hazleton plant's government contract expired in 1962, most of their customers became private industries. The plant was then bought by Kawicki Barilko, and they sold it to the Cabot Corporation in 1978. Concerned about beryllium-related diseases, the workers organized in 1970. Doctors told the workers, many of whom had previously worked in coal mines, that their symptoms they were describing were that of miner's asthma. Upon learning from workers about the conditions inside the plant, the OCAW brought in doctors and an industrial hygienists. Independent medical consultations led to the diagnosis of 7 cases of beryllium disease among them. And of those 7 people, they did pass X-ray exams that were provided by local doctors. The OCAW also fought to obtain records of air sampling conducted by Pennsylvania's Department of Health. Some of these records were eventually released, indicating high levels of exposure to beryllium dust. The tragedy of Hazleton is that both corporate and government sectors abdicated responsibilities to these workers. After a long struggle, workers had finally won the right to know about substances they work with. What workers needed now was the power to act on that knowledge. They should be trained as inspectors and deputized by the federal government to ensure all health and safety regulations. Corporate control of all industry, hygiene, and medicine must also be under the controls of the potential victims, that is, the workers. Former workers and their families claim more than 90 deaths on the elevated beryllium levels in that plant. Here's the story of another man. We will call him Bobby. He worked at the plant from 1960 to 1973. Almost from the beginning of his employment, he was sick. It started with skin rashes. He developed a cough, and as he was coughing, a clear liquid would come out of his lungs. He just never felt right or normal after that. He died from beryllium disease in 1986 at the age of 58. His death and other workers' deaths could have been prevented, since the medical community and the government knew about the hazards of beryllium exposure. Medical screening costs from $300 to $350 per worker. It can help monitor for symptoms of the disease, and once it's detected, treatment can be prescribed. You can't cure it, but they can give you some treatment to help you. Despite the contribution of these workers to the Cold War effort, they are finding little recourse for health monitoring or care. Because beryllium disease can take 20 years to surface, the workers often experience the health consequences of their jobs long after the Pennsylvania's 6-year statute of limitations on workman's compensation runs out. I don't even know what to say about that. That's just horrible. Several lawsuits filed to hold Kawicki, Barilko, and Cabot responsible for some medical liabilities failed. The courts have ruled that workers cannot prove that their employers intentionally injured them. The corporations argued that once excessive exposure levels were detected, workers were issued respirators. Once excessive levels were detected, they gave them respirators. They didn't give them respirators right away. Only when the levels were so high it was wrong. Wrong. Plant management also took yearly chest x-rays to detect the disease and installed safety equipment in the 70s. In the 70s, 13 years after the plant was built, even though they knew about the danger when the plant was built. The courts have ruled that Cabot Corporation, who did not respond to request for comment, has no legal responsibility for the health of former workers. But they are held legally responsible for the environmental damage. They expect to spend $4 million to clean up the site. Clean up the land, but don't help the people that are hurt. Millions of dollars were spent to cover or bury the shit left over, yet they won't spend a few $1,000s on the workers, says a former worker at a 1994 meeting. Now that pond that you see in my video was supposed to have a clay lining underneath and a cap on top to prevent that water from seeping down into the water table. I don't know if they put the clay lining in the bottom. Denied medical assistance by the orders of beryllium plant and the state workers' compensation program, former workers sought DOE relief. The DOE conducts a beryllium workers' health surveillance program at Rocky Flats and Oak Ridge. Given that the beryllium process at Hazleton supplied Rocky Flats, the OCAW appealed to the Energy Secretary, Hazel O'Leary, in 1994 to have the Hazleton workers included in this program. 8 months later, the agency refused. A February 1995 response from DOE said there is no apparent legislative authority to include former Hazleton workers in the program. To me, it just sounds like they kicked them to the curb. The people suffering and dying as a result of their occupational exposure to beryllium will be relieved, if not surprised, at the government's continuing commitment to their health, just like all the current and past DOE workers, no doubt, have been bowled over by DOE's response to their health concerns. I was shocked when the DOE turned us down, said Jim. The cost of a screening program is petty cash to them. Yes, the screening program is petty cash, but they had to spend millions of dollars to clean up the site. Congress passed portions of the Defense Nuclear Workers Bill of Rights in 1992, which mandates the DOE's new cleanup mission must include medical surveillance. Well, that's a good thing, huh? But the DOE has yet to request funding for the medical surveillance requirements that were included in the Defense Reauthorization Act covering the fiscal year of 1993, according to OCAW. The DOE allocated $300,000 per year to the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health for a 3-year screening and surveillance program that does not include the Hazleton workers. I don't know why these people fell through the cracks. They shouldn't have. They should have been included. The whole thing is just so wrong in my eyes. I personally know a man. He was passionate about his motorcycle. He loved to ride. He worked at the plant. He got the disease. It came to the point where he was on constant oxygen and he could not ride his beloved motorcycle. He would just sit in the garage, sitting on his bike with his oxygen tank hooked up, with his eyes closed, just pretending to ride. He died years later, a broken shell of a man. Well, that's the tale of the beryllium plant just outside of Hazleton. It's a sad tale. People were injured, people were hurt, and they just fell through the cracks. Thank you for coming. Sorry this wasn't my usual uplifting, happy explorer, but it's a story that has just kind of died over time. And people need to be aware with the materials they're working with. Anybody, any kind of job you have, you could possibly be exposed to materials that'll hurt you. You have to be aware. You have to investigate. You have to do research. And above all, protect yourself. When the company offers you protective gear, take it, use it, wear it. be safe. Safety first. I used to work in the stripping just over the hill. I used to drive one of those big haul trucks. It was interesting. And the cabs were climate controlled. I took advantage of it, yes. I rolled the windows up, put the air conditioning on. You did what I had to, and had the filters changed in the air filtration unit. I didn't want to breathe in coal dust. I wanted to be safe. I don't want any of that miner's asthma because, you know, they've been fighting miner's asthma because they say it's preventable, which it is. If you use all the proper equipment and, you know, don't breathe the dust, use the climate control that they offer, take it, use it. Anyhow, sorry for the long exit. There's just so much going through my mind. It's just, the whole thing's just sad. Anyhow, out there, be safe, and hope to see you soon. Peace, baby.